Hi, I'm Ztarli, and in this video I'll be exploring the different layer blending modes while shading a painting. So I've just pulled up an unfinished piece of artwork. This is just a flat coloured reference picture I'd made for myself that I never got around to finishing. So I'm just using it as a base to do my shading on. To begin with, I'm just exploring the different layer blending modes for the line art. So I'm just going through and just selecting them all until I'm happy with them. This is normally how I would decide on a blending mode, but in this video I'll be going into a little bit more detail on the different blending modes and basically what they do for you. Now there is a bunch of maths behind how all of these blending modes work, and if you want to look that up you can just Google it. I tried to look at it myself, but honestly my head got a bit confused with all the different equations and stuff that are actually involved in all these different blending modes. So I'm just going to cut down to basically my understanding of it as from an artist point of view instead of like a mathematic one. There is a bunch of stuff at the bottom which I just don't understand how it works. I sort of get some understanding of it and then I try something and it does the opposite of what I thought it would do. So we will look at them, but you can see me trying them out now. They just kind of do weird things. But yeah, so I'll get into what the different sections sort of do, and we'll have a look at what the shading looks like. So to start with, we need a shading or blending layer. So I will normally just use a solid color, usually in the mood of the picture. So in this case, I just use a blue color, and you'll see me throughout the video push some bright yellow over the top. That's basically to imitate if I was doing a highlight layer. So most of this, I will just be demonstrating the shadow layer, and then I just put a bit of color across with a brighter color so you can see how a light color would react to that blending mode. So we'll be exploring these blending modes in the order in which they appear. Now most programs, they will actually split the different blending modes into sections, and this actually does mean different things. For instance, the top bunch you see here, they are darkening blending modes. So for the most part, when you apply different colors to this layer, when it affects the layer below it, it will apply it in a darkening way. So if you were to add some lighter colors to the picture, you'll find that it does not lighten the picture below it. It will generally just darken it, or in some cases it will just remain the same. So these modes are good for shadow layers or shading layers, and I generally use these types of layers for shading. And then the next set I usually use for highlighting, and then there is a third set below it which can be used for both. But we'll start with this top section. So the first option in the list is darken. So I've just selected the darken blend mode, and you can see it does pretty much what it says, which is it darkens the layer below it and applies the color to it. So I do use darken quite a bit. I also use multiply quite a bit, and normally I will select that type of layer mode, and then I'll turn the opacity down, and you can make hue and saturation adjustments, as you can see here, to change the mood of the picture. So you can see quite substantial changes in the mood of the picture if you just change what color you're using as the shading color. So it goes from like a quite cool looking picture to maybe a warm summer day or a sunset sort of feel. Now you can see what happens when I add a light color like this yellow to a dark blending mode is it doesn't really do much. It changes the color in some areas, but it's not darkening or brightening the picture at all. So I don't recommend adding light colors to the top section of blending modes, as it's not going to do much for you, and should be saved for different blending modes. Now this is the multiply blending mode. I find this sort of has a more saturated feel to it. So I usually decide between multiply or darken for my coloring of the picture. For line art, I will nearly always use multiply. I find because it sort of saturates colors more, it has a nicer look to the line art. It's especially handy if you've just got a picture you've taken a photo of and loaded in and it's black and white. Then if you change it to multiply, the white will disappear and you can do your colored layers underneath it. Now this is the same color yellow I was using before, and you can see it's not particularly good looking. It doesn't darken, it doesn't really brighten it, it just sort of saturates it with that particular color. So again, I don't recommend using light colors on these top bunch of blending modes. Save the light colors for a different blending mode. Now we've moved on to some of the more saturated blend modes. I'm not a huge fan of these bottom two, Color Burn and the one below it. They kind of too saturated for my liking, so I tend to avoid it. You can see it's nearly black there. Linear Burn is the other one, which I don't like coloring in black, so I tend to avoid these blend modes. And you can see with the lighter colors like the eye, it really oversaturates it for my liking. So I don't like the two bottom blend modes for darkening. I will usually avoid them and just stick with the top two. Now I'm just going to quickly skip through the next section, which is the highlighting section, or the section you'll use for lightening. As I'm just doing the shading for now, we will come back to this, but you can see it doesn't really respond well to dark colors, so you would avoid using these blend modes if you wanted to make things darker. They're better for highlighting. The next section after that begins with overlay. It's meant to actually do both darkening and lightening of your picture. So if you don't want to have two different layers for your shading, for adding shadow and highlight, you can use this next bunch of layers to see how both of them are affected at the same time. And you will need to apply both dark and light colors to these layers, as they do act similarly to the two sections above, where a light color will lighten things and a dark color will darken things. So you can see here with this overlay layer, the light yellow is lightening our green and cream colored sections, and the dark blue I already applied is also darkening the areas as well. You can see same sort of adjustments you can make with hue saturation to change the tone or mood of your picture. So it's just kind of similar to what I was doing before. I just select a blending mode and play around with it till you're happy. The downside of having them both on the one layer is obviously if you have two very different colors, if you're going to use the hue saturation to change the colors, it might be difficult to find a color that suits both the highlight and the shadow. So that's why I generally stick to having two separate layers for these two colors. But you know, you can see here, you can just pick a couple of colors, and if it works, it works. The soft light layer I'm using at the moment is a much less saturated one, a very soft, I guess as the name implies, a softer sort of coloring mode, and you can just play around until you find a nice set of colors to use on that blending mode. Now I have a similar dislike for the hard light and linear light layers than I did with the bottom layers of the darkening section. I just find them way too saturated. You can see the yellow is just way too bright for my liking. Some of this might work if you wanted to make like glowing parts of your creature or drawing, so they're still worth exploring, but in my personal opinion, they're just too saturated for my liking. You'll see here with the linear the vivid light, it is very dark with the dark colors. I do like how it reacts to light colors a bit better than the previous blend mode, but it's still too saturated for my liking. Pin light acts a little bit weird on black. You can see the line art in some of the areas has gone sort of brown. It's a bit odd, and it's got this weird sort of bloom around some of the colors. So again, this is probably a blend mode you're only going to use in specific circumstances. Maybe if you want a particular look to a glowing area or something like that, I don't really use pin light very much. Hard mix is way too saturated. It's like the ultimate saturated layer, so I don't use that very much either. So in the next two sections, I have very limited understanding of how these work, and you'll see they have very weird things that happen to them. I have no idea what's going on with this. It's just doing something. It's sort of almost like it's making it negative, but I don't think it's quite negative, and some of them do a similar thing but slightly different, so I don't really understand these blending modes. I think for me to understand them properly, I would probably need to do a bit more research and have a bit more understanding on them. They're not really things I would use for shading unless you wanted your picture to be inverted in color, which I guess can be a pretty cool thing to try, but for most of the time I wouldn't recommend these blend modes for coloring or shading, especially the second section from the bottom. The very bottom section more affects how color is applied to the layer rather than dark and light. So I know there are some people who use these layers and they do a thing where they'll like shade a picture in black and white and then monotones, and then they'll use these bottom hue and color layers to apply the color to that, but I don't properly understand how that works. You can see here it's kind of working where I'm applying a yellow color. It's just adding the yellow color to the different values underneath it. So I sort of get the idea on how it works, but again, I kind of need to experiment more or research more to understand it fully. So if this is the kind of thing you want to try out, you want to just shade without having to worry about color and then apply color later, then the bottom layers are the bottom blend modes are the ones you want to explore. So I like trying to play around with this at the moment. So I've just made my bottom layer just gray tones, and then I'm using the color layer to add color to it above. So you can see it kind of works. So I thought I was getting somewhere here, but as soon as I started adding a lighter color, it all fell apart. So it kind of just made it gray instead. So again, I just need to research this more so I can understand how these bottom bunch of layers work. But I do think, as I mentioned before, there is some value in the bottom bunch of layers. So after playing around a little bit more, I decide to use a darken layer with 80% opacity. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to mix a bit more color into this layer. So I'm actually going to lock it and then apply different colors to this layer to add a different feel to some of the colors. So I've used a dark reddish brown color here, and I'm just going to add this color to some of the areas like the ear, and around the mouth, so that it has a more sort of skin tone kind of color to it, as I don't always want the whole picture to have the same colored tone to it. So this is one of my favorite things to do with shading layers. You don't have to stick to one color, you can change things up, and you can do this at any stage. So you can shade it, as long as it's on a separate layer, you can shade it any color you like, and then if later on you want, I want to change it or I want to add more in, just lock the layer and shade over those parts with a different color like I'm doing here. I did mention before that darken layers, the top bunch of layers, isn't very good for using a lighter color. The one exception to that is when I actually want to bring back some of the lightness from the layer below but in a different color, like I've done at the bottom of the neck there. So I've just used a light-ish blue, not a super light blue, but lighter than what I would normally use for shading, just to add in a bit of reflected light back into the picture using my shadow or darken layer. So just kind of muck around a bit more with different colors for a little bit. And now I'll just show you what this layer looks like on an ordinary blend mode, so the normal mode. So you can actually see the different colors I've used during the shading part of this picture. So now we're going to do the highlight layer. So I am going to return to the second section of the blend mode to show you how I use highlight layers. To begin with, I'm just putting down some solid light color. Again, it doesn't really matter what color you choose at this stage. You can use the hue saturation to change it, and just going through different blend modes to find what you like. So we start with lighten, then we have screen. This one is color dodge, and here we have linear dodge. We'll also quickly have a look at the section below, which again affects light and dark on the layers. So this is just a highlight layer, but just so you can see how these yellows are looking using these blending modes. I am not going to be using this section. I will just be using my darken layer, and I've decided to choose the color dodge for this particular layer I'm on at the moment, which is my highlight layer. I like how it's giving this nice warm sort of sunsetty sort of feel to some parts of it. I like how it's affecting that layer, so that's the one I'm going to choose. Now you may have just noticed this, but I spend way less time on my highlight layer than I do on my shadow layer. I find it a lot easier to find nice and pleasing colors when I'm shading things darker rather than I'm lightening areas. So I'm not as experienced with these layers as I am with the darkening layers or modes. But you can see here, it's the same sort of principle. You can apply different colors. They affect the layer below differently and can give different feels to or moods to your picture. For this one, I stick with the warmer color, and I'm just going to do the same thing I did with my darken layer, which is lock the layer and then apply different colors to different parts of the picture, as I don't want the green to be as yellow as it appears. So I'm just painting over it with a blue color instead, and you can see it sort of brings it back down to a more greeny looking color, and the light doesn't end up as harsh. As I mentioned before, I do really like that sort of harsh orangey sort of color on the horns and the darker areas, so I am going to pretty much leave those as is. So after fooling around with my highlight layer for a little bit, I decide it's done enough. So this next part, I'm just going to show you how you can use blending modes to change the whole color of your picture. So I'll start with adding a gradient layer. So we've created a new layer above everything, and I just dump a gradient color down on the page, and then we'll try some different blending modes and we'll see how they affect the entire picture below it. I do smudge this layer just a little bit because I don't like how rigid the color transformation looked, just to make it a little bit more natural. I also realized we needed a background for this gradient to affect, so I've just grabbed a random background from one of my folders to put behind the picture, so you can actually see how the gradient would affect a full colored picture rather than just the character. So this is darken, which is the top one, and then we have multiply. You can see it's a bit more saturated. Color burn is gross. Linear burn is also gross. Lighten is very light, but if you turn the opacity down, you might be able to get some interesting effects for this. As you can see here, it would probably need a bit of playing with to use this, but I have used lighten in quite a few scenarios. For instance, you can erase away some of the areas that are meant to be left in shadow and just leave your lighten layer to affect the whole layer. I have done this before. It does make for some nice pictures where you want, I know, some particles to be in the air. Maybe they're in a cave and there's light streaming in through the cave and you just want it to hit certain parts of the character. That's what I find these sort of gradient layers to be good for. I don't really use them for the whole picture anymore. I will usually erase back over them. So the next one is screen of color dodge, which is a bit weird. Linear dodge is after that. Oh yeah, I should turn the opacity back up. There's color dodge. A linear dodge is kind of nice. I don't mind that one. Overlay, sort of a bit darker. Soft lights, hard lights, could be interesting. It could be a bit of fun. It's very saturated, but you know, you could use it for something. This is why I just go through all the layers and I try them all, because I don't ever really know exactly how a color is going to affect the layer below. So I do find, in my mind at least, it's easier for me to just put down a layer and then go through all the blend modes and see how they go. But I guess if you have something in particular in mind, you can keep in mind that the first bunch of blend modes are darkening, the second bunch are lightening, and the middle ones are meant to be dark and light. And then the ones after that are just weirdos, and the very bottom ones affect color and saturation. Now, as with shadow and highlight layers, you can of course change the hue and saturation at any process, any part in the process, and you can see how it has a very different effect on how the whole picture feels. So this is a good way to change the entire mood of the picture. If you suddenly decided you wanted something completely different, you could just put a whole layer above everything and change the whole sort of temperature of the picture. And that's basically how I use blending modes or blending layers in Artflow. I generally use this as a kicking off point for my next stage, which is usually the painting stage. So after I'm happy with how a shadow or light layer is, I generally merge them together like I have done here. I then grab the smudge tool to blur some of those edges and make the color transition a bit more gradual. Then once I'm happy with how things have been smudged in, I'll start painting over some areas by grabbing the teardropper and just teardropping the colors in between and painting over some parts to make a more sort of a sharper edge to some of the color transitions and just neaten up some of the wobbliness that is left by my smudge tool. And that's basically how I like to color. I actually really like the colors I ended up with on this picture. The dark and light layers really made a pleasing color palette for this, so I'm very happy with how this turned out. And I actually decided to crop this picture after I'd finished doing the examples. I never actually colored the bottom half of it. It was only over the head, but I have cropped it and decided to use it for my Discord icon. So thank you to the people who asked for me to talk about blending modes. It ended up making a pretty cool little Discord icon. Well, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and I also have a Patreon if you'd like to support me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!